Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're diving into excerpts from Acts chapter 17 in the New King James Version of the Bible. We'll be focusing on the Apostle Paul and his companions and how they went about spreading their message. We're also going to be looking at how people reacted to this message as they traveled from city to city.
Yes. This journey takes them through a variety of cultural landscapes. I mean, we're talking about everything from synagogues in Thessalonica to the philosophical circles in Athens. And we'll get to see how Paul changes his approach to try to connect with all these very different audiences and how he faces both acceptance and resistance along the way.
So we're going to start in Thessalonica. The text says that Paul went to the synagogue 3 Sabbaths in a row. And it's interesting to me that he reasoned with them from the scriptures instead of just, coming in and giving them a totally new message.
Right. That's really important. Paul was a Jewish scholar, so he was incredibly knowledgeable about the Hebrew scriptures. And he really saw Christianity as the fulfillment of Judaism, not as a rejection of it. So when he reasoned with them from the scriptures, he was trying to connect the dots between what they already believed and what he was teaching about Jesus.
So he's not trying to tell them to forget everything they know. He's more like, hey, this is how this new idea fits in with what you already understand.
Exactly. And this method worked on some of the people in Thessalonica. The text says that some devout Greeks and some leading women were persuaded by Paul's message.
But then there was also some pretty strong opposition that popped up in Thessalonica. What can you tell me about that?
Well, remember that what Paul was introducing was a very new idea. The idea that Jesus, a crucified Jewish man, was the Messiah and the Son of God. So this was a pretty big challenge to the current religious and political systems.
Yeah, I mean, the accusations against Paul and Silas, his companion, are intense. Turning the world upside down, acting against Caesar, that's some serious stuff.
It really was, especially the accusation that they were proclaiming another king, meaning Jesus. That was dangerous in the Roman world because it sounded like treason against the emperor.
It really makes you think about how anytime a new idea comes along that threatens to disrupt things, it tends to get that kind of pushback, right? Because people are scared of anything that might change their worldview.
Definitely. Throughout history, we see so many examples of people resisting new ideas, whether it's in science or religion, politics, or social movements.
So Paul and Silas are facing this opposition, and they end up having to leave Thessalonica, and they go to Berea. But this time they get a very different response, don't they?
Yes, the Bereans are described as being more fair-minded, and what that means in this situation is that they were open to hearing new ideas, and they wanted to actually consider those ideas. They listened to Paul, but they didn't just blindly believe him.
They didn't just take his word for it. They searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so.
Exactly. Their approach to this is a great model of critical thinking. They wanted to make sure that what Paul was teaching actually made sense with what they already knew.
It's a really good reminder for all of us, isn't it? To not just listen to things and accept them, but to actually think about things and analyze what we hear and make sure it's true, especially since there are so many different voices and opinions out there these days.
You're absolutely right. So how do you go about evaluating information and making your own judgments?
Well, I think about who's saying something and if there's any proof to back it up, and I try to look at things from different perspectives before I make any decisions. What about you?
Yeah, I do pretty much the same thing. And that's exactly what the Bereans were doing. They were engaging with what Paul was teaching with open minds, but they were also being careful and thinking critically. They wanted to make sure that what they were hearing actually lined up with the truth as they understood it.
Yeah, unfortunately for Paul, even though the Bereans were open-minded, he ended up running into more problems. Those people who were causing trouble in Thessalonica. Well, they followed Paul to Berea and stirred up trouble again and forced him to move on.
Right, and that just shows you that you can get opposition from all kinds of places sometimes, even from the groups or systems that you're already part of. It's not always people from the outside who resist change. Sometimes the people who feel most threatened by new ideas are the ones who are already part of the establishment.
That's really interesting. It wasn't Roman authorities or pagan philosophers who forced Paul to leave Berea, but the people from his own religion who felt like he was challenging them.
Exactly. It's complicated when new ideas come up against strongly held beliefs and you throw power structures into the mix too.
And so Berea was getting to be a hostile place for Paul. So he moves on again, this time to Athens, a city that was famous for all its intellectual and philosophical activity.
Athens was a city full of philosophers, poets, and artists. People were always debating and discussing new ideas. But it was also a city that was given over to idols, as the text describes it. So for Paul, it's a place that's both intellectually stimulating and spiritually challenging.
I can just imagine him getting to Athens and seeing all those statues and temples everywhere and being like, okay, this is going to be interesting.
I know, right? And then in Athens, we see Paul meeting a whole new group of people, the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers.
Oh, yeah, the Epicureans and Stoics. Those
Yeah.
are two of the main schools of thought in the ancient world, weren't they? Can you tell us a little bit about what they believed?
Sure. The Epicureans believed that the goal in life was to experience pleasure and avoid pain. They were all about living, simply avoiding excess and finding inner peace.
So they were into enjoying life but not going overboard.
Exactly. The Stoics, on the other hand, believed that being virtuous was the most important thing. And they thought that we should use reason to control our emotions and actions. They focused on self-control duty and accepting whatever happened in life.
So the Stoics were all about living in harmony with nature and using reason. They sound kind of like people who practice mindfulness today.
Yeah, I can see that. Both of these philosophies had different ideas about how to live a good life, and they both had a big influence on how people thought back then.
So how did these philosophers react to Paul and his message?
Well, it really depended. Some of them just dismissed him as a babbler, someone who didn't make any sense. Others were kind of interested in what he was saying about Jesus and the resurrection, but mainly because it was something new that sparked their curiosity.
It's a perfect example of how people handle new ideas, isn't it? Some people are immediately like, no way, while others are more willing to consider different viewpoints, even if they don't agree with everything.
That's so true. It shows how differently people react to things they're not familiar with, and how hard it can be to communicate when people have such different worldviews.
It reminds me of that quote by Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, who said, "The trouble with most people is that they think with their hopes or fears or wishes rather than with their minds."
Wow, that's really insightful. It's hard to set aside our own biases and preconceived notions and truly be open to new ideas. That's really what Paul's encounter with those Athenian philosophers shows us.
So what happened with that encounter? What happened next?
Well, because of his interaction with the philosophers, Paul was invited to speak at the Areopagus. That was a very important council in Athens where they would debate philosophical and religious issues.
The Areopagus. That sounds like a pretty big deal. Can you tell me more about it?
Well, the Areopagus was a rocky hill just northwest of the Acropolis. It was where the important people in Athens would get together, like philosophers, poets, and lawmakers, to discuss things that affected everyone. It was basically the intellectual center of the city.
So Paul got the chance to share his ideas with the elite of Athens. How did he use that opportunity?
He gave one of the most amazing speeches in the entire New Testament. It showed how skilled he was at speaking, how well he understood his audience, and how strongly he believed in what he was teaching.
That sounds like a really important moment for Paul. What happened at the Areopagus?
Well, that's a story for the next part of our deep dive. We'll talk about Paul's speech and why it was so important for his mission to spread the Christian message.
Okay, so last time we left Paul standing in front of the Areopagus, which was like the intellectual center of Athens, ready to share his message with this really smart and influential audience. And I'm curious how he handled this challenge.
Yeah, a lot of people see Paul's speech at the Areopagus as a perfect example of how to communicate across cultures. It shows that he really knew how to speak persuasively and how to adapt his message so that different groups of people could understand and connect with it.
So did he start off by launching into a whole theological lecture about Jesus and the resurrection?
Not exactly. He started by talking about something he had noticed about Athenian culture. He said that they were very religious, which, if you think about all the temples and statues in Athens, is kind of an understatement.
I can totally picture him pointing to the Acropolis with all those huge temples and saying something like, "You guys are really into your gods, huh?" But he wasn't being sarcastic, right?
Nope, not at all. He was trying to find common ground and show them that he respected what they believed. He was acknowledging that religion was a big part of their society. It's a really smart way to start a conversation when you're trying to talk to people who have different views, then you do something we can all learn from.
Yeah, it's like finding that connection, that thing you both agree on that can help you understand each other better.
Exactly. And then Paul took it a step further. He talked about an altar he had seen in the city that was dedicated to the unknown God. And he used that to introduce his idea of the one true God.
It's like he was saying, look, you already admit that there might be gods out there that you don't even know about. So let me tell you about the God who made everything. The God who is bigger than your temples and statues. The God who gives life to everyone. It's such a clever way to connect with what they already believed.
It really is. He wasn't trying to get rid of their understanding of religion. He was trying to make it bigger to show them a wider view that included what they already believed, but also pointed to something beyond that.
And it's interesting how he presented his message. He doesn't really talk about sin or judgment, which were big themes in his preaching in other places. Instead, he focuses on God as the creator, the one who gives life and breath to all of us. He talks about how God is present in the world and in each of us.
Exactly. He was shaping his message for this specific audience, emphasizing the parts of his beliefs that would most likely resonate with them. Remember, the Athenians were known for being curious and loving knowledge and reason. So Paul appealed to that by talking about God in a way that was both intellectually stimulating and spiritually satisfying.
And he showed that he understood Greek culture by quoting one of their own poets. He said, "For in him we live and move and have our being," which comes from a poem by Epimenides, a philosopher and poet from Crete.
That's right. By including a quote from someone the Greeks respected, Paul was building another bridge between his message and the people he was talking to. He was showing them that his beliefs weren't something strange or incompatible with their own intellectual tradition.
That's so smart.
Yeah.
He wasn't just preaching at them. He was engaging with them on their level, using their language and cultural references to get his point across. It's a powerful lesson in how to communicate across cultures.
Absolutely. Paul shows us how important it is to understand who you're talking to, their values, their beliefs, the way they think. It's about meeting people where they are intellectually and culturally and finding ways to understand each other.
So how did the Athenians react to Paul's speech? Were they all convinced and ready to become Christians?
Well, not exactly. It was a mixed bag. Some people made fun of him and thought his ideas were ridiculous. Others were intrigued and wanted to know more, and then some people actually became Christians.
It just shows you that even if you're a really persuasive speaker, you can't make everyone agree with you. People come to new ideas with all their own experiences, biases, fears, and hopes.
That's true. Persuasion is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. You need patience, empathy, and you have to be willing to meet people where they are, both intellectually and emotionally.
And sometimes you just have to plant the seed and trust that it will grow in its own time.
Yeah. Exactly. You can't force people to change their minds, but you can give them a new perspective, a new way of looking at things, and sometimes that's enough to start a real change.
Thinking about Paul's travels to these different cities, I'm amazed by all the obstacles he had to overcome to share his message. He faced opposition, hostility, even threats to his safety. It makes me wonder what lessons we can learn from this, and how can we apply them to our own lives, to those conversations we have with people who see things differently than we do.
That's a really great question. I think one of the biggest things we can take away from Paul's experience is the importance of empathy. He always tried to understand his audience, their beliefs, their values, what they were afraid of, and what they hoped for. He didn't just lecture them, he had real conversations with them.
So it's just as much about listening as it is about talking.
Absolutely. It's about trying to understand how someone else sees the world, even if you don't agree with them.
It also makes me think about how important it is to find things we have in common, those shared values and experiences that can help us connect with people who have different viewpoints.
Exactly. Even when we disagree, there are usually more things that bring us together than things that separate us. It's about finding those connections and building on them.
And what about having the courage to say what we believe, even when we know it might not be popular or might cause controversy?
That's where integrity comes in. It's about being true to what you believe while also respecting what other people believe. It's about finding that balance between speaking your truth and listening to the truths of others.
Paul's journey through Thessalonica, Berea, and Athens is full of really valuable lessons about how to communicate, how to understand different viewpoints, and how to navigate a world where different beliefs and values often clash.
It's a story that still speaks to us today as we try to understand each other better and create a world that is more peaceful and harmonious.
So as we keep going with our look at Acts chapter 17, I'm thinking about all the different kinds of people Paul talked to, from the Jewish people in Thessalonica to those philosophers in Athens. He was always adjusting his message so it would make sense to whoever he was with. It's like he was a communication pro, always changing his approach for each new situation.
You're right about that. Paul's journey is like a textbook example of how to be persuasive when you're communicating. He knew that it's not enough to just give out information. You have to understand who you're talking, to respect their views, and find ways to bridge the gap between different ways of thinking.
And that brings us back to that speech he gave at the Areopagus, remember, where he was talking to those Athenian intellectuals and leaders. It's a key moment in his travels, a chance to share his message with a group that has a lot of influence.
Definitely. And as we said before, Paul didn't start preaching about sin and salvation. He had a more subtle approach that showed he really got Athenian culture and their way of thinking.
Right. He started by talking about how religious they were, how much they revered the divine. He even mentioned that altar to the unknown God as proof that they were open to new spiritual ideas.
Exactly. He wasn't putting down what they already believed. He was saying, hey, what you believe is valid, but there might be even more to discover a deeper understanding of the divine that includes what you already think, but goes beyond it too.
It's like he was saying, you're already on a spiritual path, but I'm offering you a new route, a new way to understand where life and meaning come from.
That's it. And he explained this new path in a way that would make sense to the Athenians. He talked about God as the one who created everything, the source of life and breath, the one who's bigger than anything humans can build or imagine.
And he even quoted from one of their own poets, Epimenides, who wrote, "For in him we live and move and have our being." By using something familiar from their own culture, he showed them that his message wasn't weird or against their intellectual tradition.
Smart, right? It shows how well Paul understood people. He knew they'd be more open to new ideas if they could connect them to what they already believed and valued.
Like he was building a bridge between their world and his, a bridge of understanding so they could see things in a new way. But even with such a well-crafted message, not everyone's on board, were they?
Yeah, you know how it's been throughout Paul's journey. Not everyone bought into what he was saying. Some people laughed at him and thought he was a fool. Others were curious and wanted to hear more. And of course, some people actually became Christians.
It shows that no matter how good you are at communicating, you can't make everyone agree with you. People come to new ideas with their own baggage, biases, fears, and hopes.
Exactly. Persuasion isn't something you can do all at once. It takes time and empathy. You have to meet people where they are, both intellectually and emotionally.
And sometimes all you can do is plant the seed and have faith that it'll grow when it's ready.
True. You can't force people to change their minds, but you can offer a different way of seeing things. And that might be enough to get things moving in a new direction.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into Acts chapter 17, I'm impressed by Paul's courage and how he never gave up on sharing his message, even when things got tough. His journey through all these different cities gives us a lot to think about. It's full of lessons about communicating, understanding different points of view, and navigating a world where people have all sorts of beliefs and values that sometimes clash.
I agree. Paul's story is a reminder that good communication isn't just about the words you say. It's about making connections, building understanding, and creating space for real conversations where people can learn and grow. It's about respecting everyone, even those you disagree with, and approaching every conversation with empathy and respect.
And I think it's about recognizing that we can all learn from each other, even when we don't see eye to eye. By listening to each other, talking things through, and finding things we agree on, we can build bridges and create a world that's more peaceful and harmonious.
That's a beautiful thought and a perfect way to end our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of Acts chapter 17. I hope it's made you curious and inspired you to think more about the power of communication and how important it is to connect with people even when we're different.